Hello and welcome to this little video for my IGCSE biology class about homeostasis, which is chapter 14 here in Mary Jones's biology book. All the stuff done here is primarily made for my own class and teaching, but if anybody else can use it, you're more than welcome. It's 100% non-profit. And all mistakes here are mine and mine alone and does not reflect on any way on Cambridge or the syllabus. So, chapter 14 here in the book talks about homeostasis, and it primarily talks about the control of temperature and blood glucose levels. Just be aware that homeostasis, the ability to control parameters within the body, are hugely important. We talked about others earlier. Maintaining the amount of CO2 in the blood, too much CO2 in the blood, we start breathing faster, too little CO2, we start breathing slower. We also talked about the kidney and how they help regulate the amount of water in the body. So a lot of stuff happening in our body is about maintaining homeostasis. We want enough water, we want the right pH, we want the right amount of CO2, we want the right amount of oxygen. There's a lot of things that the body is trying to control at all times. Calorie intake, for example, as well. The body wants the correct amount of food, it wants the right nutrients. All of this is being done in our body. So just be aware that when we talk about temperature and blood glucose here, it's just the two parts of homeostasis that Cambridge have chosen to focus on, but be aware that there are many, many others, and that all animals and all plants, they tend to regulate the contents of their cell in a specific way. And when we can't do that anymore, when we no longer can keep a specific concentration inside our cells, that's when we die. So being alive is about being able to control these parameters here within the cell and within the body. So, without further ado, let's get on with it. So, temperature control. Basically, we have two ways of doing this within the animal kingdom. We have the endothermic and the exothermic. Endothermic is mammals and birds. Exothermic is pretty much everything else, although there is some exceptions to it. Endothermic means you maintain the same temperature inside at all time. Endo means inside, like endoparasite. Exo means that the temperature on the outside determines the temperature on the inside. Again, there are, for example, fish like tuna who keeps a higher temperature inside than the water on the outside. They're not true endothermic, but there are, as always, some organism who blurs the line. So, why are there these two different strategies? Well, the smart thing about being endothermic is that, as we learned in the chapter about enzymes, is all enzymes have a specific temperature when they work the best. So, for example, the enzymes in our muscle, in our digestion, they tend to work at a specific temperature. And for example, as we humans tend to have a core temperature of 37 degrees Celsius, it means our enzymes are always at the optimal temperature. They're always ready to go, just do work. While if you're exothermic, well, sometimes it might be hot and they're working really fast. At other times, you might be cold, which means they are working slower. If you want to see this, you can have a look at a lizard or a snake on a cold day. On a cold day, that lizard is not moving very fast, but if it sits in the sun for a while, it can really move around. Now, the problem about being endothermic, like having the same core temperature at all time, is it's expensive, not in money, but in energy. We spend a lot of energy keeping our body warm. It's like if I want my car to be at optimal temperature at all time, I kept the engine running 24/7. Yes, the engine would be warm and ready to go at a moment's notice, but I also will burn a lot of fuel. Being exothermic is way, way cheaper. You need to spend less energy. That is also why that I need to eat, well, quite often, maybe too often, some will say, why our lizards and our snakes and so on, they can eat less often because they simply need less energy. Many animals who are exothermic then have behaviors to help them be at the right temperature. That is, for example, why you often see reptiles warming themselves in the sun before they have to be active. So they've found a behavioral way of getting around this. So these are two ways, endo and exothermic. And we are going to talk about how to control body temperature as a endothermic today. So let's talk about how our body keeps temperature constant. As we talked about in the chapter about reflex arcs, we have receptors in our skin and different parts in the body. For example, on my skin here, I have receptors who can feel the temperature. And let's be honest, the temperature here at Ranum F School right now is freezing. So my sensors here, my receptors, sends a signal to the brain, the part of the brain called the hypothalamus, telling me that it's kind of cold here. Once that signal gets sent to the brain then can send a signal here to try to deal with it. And our body has different methods of then keeping the temperature constant. One thing is it will start burning more calories. And maybe it'll make me move a little more. If it's really cold, I might start to shiver just to try to create more heat by like shivering the muscles, keep the muscles active. Also, it will make the hair stand up on my skin, and by doing that, it creates an isolated layer, like putting on a sweater. And also, it will constrict the blood vessels going through my skin, which means my skin will grow a little paler because there'll be less blood running through my skin. The surface of my skin is where I lose the most of my body heat. So if there's less hot blood coming through my skin, I will then lose less body heat. Then that will send a signal back, okay? And then receptors will look again. Am I now keeping the temperature? If not, I might start to shake even more. Or maybe now I'll be warm enough and then the receptors will keep the feedback loop going and I'll keep the temperature constant. Of course, there can be cases where our body can't do this, and I'll talk about this in the end. The other way is my receptors might feel I'm a little too warm now. I might be working out, I might be out in the sun, in the sauna, and so on. So now I'm getting too warm. And the hypothalamus then sends a signal to my skin to start sweating. By sweating, we remove heat through evaporation. It will also tell the hairs to lay down, so there's less isolation. And it will also open up my blood vessels, so there's more blood running to the surface of the skin. Thereby, when the sweat evaporates, it will cool the blood. That is why if you're not running and it's warm, you find yourself being all red and sweaty. Red because there's more blood going to the skin, and more sweaty because you have water evaporating to cool you down. And this feedback system will then keep under normal conditions our body within, these 37 degrees of core temperature. Now, if I were to jump into icy water, I won't do that. Eventually, the body will not be able to defend its core temperature and the core temperature will start to drop. And if that happens, I will go into hypothermia and I'll start shivering a lot, and eventually, if the body temperature drops enough, I will stop shivering, and then I am in danger because if the body temperature falls too low, the body starts shutting down, and eventually I might go into cardiac arrest. The other way around, I might be somewhere so hot that the body cannot cool itself. I might be, for example, sitting for a long time inside a sauna. I might be running in the desert. Trust me, I won't do that. And in that case, body temperature will go up, and even though I am sweating, although my skin is getting a lot of blood into it, my core temperature will keep increasing, and if that increases too much, I might go into heat stroke, where I lose consciousness simply due to too much heat. So, homeostasis, our body wants to keep this temperature and will do a lot to defend it. So, the other feedback system we have to look at today is blood glucoses. Again, our body likes to keep the amount of blood glucoses or blood sugar within fairly set limits. And here we're going to look at how the body then responds. So let's say, for example, I just ate a huge meal. As I do that, the nutrients will get broken down and will get absorbed over the intestine wall, and then I might then have a high blood glucoses. There's enough sugar in my blood now. What happens then is in the pancreas then a hormone called insulin is then released. Insulin then sends a signal to the body to start storing the sugar. We don't need all that sugar now, start storing it. So the liver stores glucoses as glycogen. That is stored some sugar in the different cells, and if I have a high insulin for a long time, it will also send a signal to my body to start storing body fat, as we do over Christmas. And then the blood sugar will hopefully fall into normal levels again. So that is one way to regulate the blood glucose level. But it might also be that my blood glucose level is low. It might be a long time since I've been eating. I might have been exercising hard. So now my blood glucose is low. Again, this sends a signal to the pancreas, who then releases another hormone, glucagon, which then sends a signal to the liver to start breaking down glycogen into glucoses, which is then released into the blood, and thereby normalizing blood sugar levels. Of course, this is assuming that I have glycogen in my liver. If, for example, I haven't been eating for a couple of days, which, by the way, I won't recommend, there won't be much glycogen back here in the liver, and our body then have to burn fat and do stuff that's called ketosis, but that's a totally different story, which is not part of the syllabus. What is important to remember is that if blood sugar is high, we release insulin. If it's low, we release glycogen. Okay. The last part of the chapter touches on what happens when we can't control our blood sugar. And this is a disease called diabetes, and there's really two versions of it, type 1 and type 2. Now the chapter here mainly talks about type 1, but I'm also going to include a little bit about type 2 because it is an important and growing problem here in our developed world. In type 1 diabetes, for some reason, the cells that we need to make insulin in our pancreas are destroyed. This might be some kind of autoimmune reaction, and we're not really sure why it happens. Some people just get it, and it has nothing to do with lifestyle as far as we know. But the problem is when we can't make insulin anymore, you can't control your blood sugar. So this requires medication, and it requires the patient to monitor their blood glucose level. So if their blood glucose level is too high, they can use insulin, and if their blood glucose level is too low, they need to eat some food. If this is medicated, people can live a quite normal life. but without insulin, it is a deadly disease, and people used to die of it quite quickly. But now that we have insulin, people can live a normal and healthy life, even with diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is when the cells who are supposed to make the insulin doesn't work anymore. Type 2 diabetes is something where the body no longer has the same sensitivity to insulin as it's supposed to have. And it was usually called old people's diabetes because as we get older, our body gets worse at using insulin and our cells get less sensitive. But other things can trigger it as well. Obesity, lack of activity, and maybe other factors in our life, because we do see a huge increase in type 2 diabetes among people living in the Western world. This might be food, this might be lack of exercise, stress, chemicals in our environment, but if you have type 2 diabetes, this might require medication. You might need to medicate like a type 1 patient, but also for some patients, just changing exercise regime and how they eat can be enough to at least lower the risks or even remove it. So with type 2, lifestyle can change it. With type 1, you absolutely need the medicine to keep it under control.